I used to believe that poverty built character. That's what my parents, Carmen and Victor Reeves, told me every time I asked why we couldn't afford things other families seemed to take for granted. Money doesn't grow on trees, Maya, my mother would say, folding coupons at our tiny kitchen table. We're teaching you the value of hard work. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're all watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. So I worked through high school, saving every penny for college while my classmates worried about prom dresses and spring break trips. I worked 2 jobs through university, my hands permanently stained with coffee from the campus cafe and my back aching from stocking shelves at the grocery store until midnight. I lived on generic mac and cheese and instant coffee, told myself it was temporary, that the struggle would pay off eventually. My apartment was a studio the size of most people's closets, with a mattress on the floor and textbooks stacked like building blocks around my desk. The heating barely worked, so I studied wrapped in every blanket I owned, my breath visible in the frigid air. When my laptop finally died senior year, I spent weeks saving just to buy a refurbished one that crashed every few hours. But I never complained. Not when my shoes had holes that let in the rain. Not when I had to choose between buying groceries or the required textbook for my economics class. Not when I spent Christmas alone because I couldn't afford the bus ticket home. I told myself this was normal, that everyone struggled, that my parents were doing their best with what little we had. The Moreau family estate had always felt like something out of a fairy tale to me. My great-uncle Sebastian lived in this sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, complete with wrought iron gates and a circular driveway lined with ancient oak trees. I'd only visited a handful of times throughout my childhood, usually for major holidays, and each time I felt like I was stepping into another world entirely. Uncle Sebastian was my grandmother's brother, a man who'd never married and had made his fortune in real estate back when the city was still growing. He was eccentric in the way only wealthy old men could be, collecting vintage pocket watches and hosting elaborate dinner parties for his handful of close friends. He always seemed genuinely happy to see me during those rare visits, asking about school and listening intently to my answers in a way that made me feel important. "You remind me of your grandmother, Maya," he'd say, his eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "She had that same determination, that fire in her eyes. She would have been so proud of you." I cherished those moments, especially since my parents always seemed uncomfortable in his presence. They'd sit stiffly during dinner, making small talk about the weather while I peppered Uncle Sebastian with questions about his antique collection or the history of the house. Looking back, I should have wondered why we visited so rarely, why my parents always found excuses to cut our stays short. The last time I saw him was during my junior year of college. He'd called me directly, which surprised me since we usually communicated through my parents, and invited me for Sunday dinner. He seemed friendlier than I remembered, moving more slowly through the grand hallways, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "I'm getting old, Maya," he said as we sat in his library after dinner, surrounded by leather-bound books that reached from floor to ceiling. "I need to start thinking about what happens to all of this when I'm gone." I nodded politely, not sure what to say. The concept of inheriting anything seemed as foreign to me as space travel. "You're the only one who's ever seemed truly interested in our family history," he continued. "The only one who asks questions, who wants to understand where we came from." Before I left that evening, he walked me to the front door and handed me an envelope. "Don't open this until you graduate," he said with a mysterious smile. "Consider it a graduation present." I tucked the envelope into my backpack and honestly forgot about it in the chaos of final exams and job applications. Uncle Sebastian passed away that winter, quietly in his sleep according to my parents. They handled all the funeral arrangements, told me not to worry about taking time off from school to attend. "He would have wanted you to focus on your education," my mother assured me over the phone. Graduation day arrived like a fever dream. After 4 years of relentless struggle, I walked across that stage in a cap and gown I'd borrowed from a friend, my diploma feeling both weightless and impossibly heavy in my hands. My parents were there, beaming with pride, talking about how all my hard work had finally paid off. That night, as I was packing up my dorm room for the final time, I found Uncle Sebastian's envelope tucked between the pages of an old textbook. My heart clenched as I remembered his words, his gentle smile, the way he'd looked at me with such hope in his eyes. Inside was a handwritten letter in his careful script. My dear Maya. If you're reading this, it means you've accomplished what I always knew you would. You've graduated despite every obstacle in your path. I've watched you struggle these past few years, working so hard to pay for school, and it breaks my heart that things have been so difficult for you. Which is why I need you to know the truth. When you turned 18, I established a trust fund in your name with your parents as trustees. It was meant to ensure you could attend university without the financial stress I saw weighing on your young shoulders. The initial deposit was $75,000, and I've added to it each year since. Your parents were supposed to tell you about this fund and help you access it for your education expenses. If they haven't mentioned it, please contact my attorney, James Morrison, immediately. His number is at the bottom of this letter. You deserve so much better than the struggles you've endured, my dear girl. You are the light of our family. With all my love. Uncle Sebastian. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking more violently with each pass. A trust fund. $75,000, plus additional contributions over the years. Money that should have paid for tuition, textbooks, decent housing, food. Money that could have allowed me to focus on my studies instead of working myself to exhaustion. Money that my parents had never mentioned. Not once. I called the attorney that very night, despite the late hour. James Morrison was a kind man with a patient voice who confirmed everything in Uncle Sebastian's letter. The trust fund existed. It had grown to nearly $100,000 by the time of my uncle's death. And my parents, as trustees, had full access to it. Has the money been used for educational purposes? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. I'm afraid that's complicated, Mr. Morrison said carefully. Perhaps you should speak with your parents first. Then, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to call me back. I drove home that night in my beat-up Honda, the same car I'd been driving since high school with its temperamental engine and broken air conditioning. The 2-hour drive gave me plenty of time to think, to replay every conversation with my parents about money, every time they'd watched me struggle without offering help. By the time I pulled into their driveway, my shock had crystallized into something much sharper. The house looked the same as always, a modest 2-story colonial that my parents had bought when I was in middle school. But now I noticed things I'd overlooked before. The new roof that had been installed my sophomore year. The renovated kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. The brand new SUV in the driveway that had replaced my mother's old sedan. Improvements they'd claimed they were saving up for. Purchases they'd said were finally possible after years of careful budgeting. I let myself in with my old key, calling out to announce my presence. My parents were in the living room, watching television, and they looked up with surprised smiles when I appeared. Maya. What a wonderful surprise, my mother said, rising to hug me. How was graduation? We're so proud of you, sweetheart. I didn't return the hug. Instead, I pulled Uncle Sebastian's letter from my pocket and held it up between us. We need to talk. The color drained from my father's face instantly. My mother's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her features before understanding dawned. Oh, she whispered. Oh, Maya. You knew, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. You knew about the trust fund, and you never told me. My father cleared his throat, struggling to meet my eyes. It's not that simple, sweetheart. There were circumstances. What circumstances could possibly justify letting me live on ramen noodles and work myself sick when there was money set aside specifically for my education? My mother sat heavily on the couch, her hands clasped in her lap. "We thought we were protecting you," she said softly. "We didn't want you to become entitled, to think money was just handed to you. We wanted you to learn the value of hard work." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Protecting me? From what? From being able to focus on my studies instead of collapsing from exhaustion every night? From being able to buy groceries without counting every penny? "We used the money for important things," my father said defensively. "The roof was leaking, and we needed to fix it before it caused structural damage. Your mother's car needed major repairs that would have cost more than it was worth. These were emergencies, Maya. Emergencies that lasted 4 years?" My voice was rising now, years of suppressed frustration finally finding release. What about my emergency? What about the nights I went hungry because I had to choose between food and textbooks? What about the time I got pneumonia because I couldn't afford to heat my apartment properly? My mother was crying now, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "We always planned to pay it back. We thought once the house was stable, once we got back on our feet financially, we could replace what we'd borrowed." Borrowed? The word came out as a snarl. "You didn't borrow anything. You stole it. That money was mine, designated for my education, and you spent it on yourselves while watching me struggle." My father's jaw tightened. "Don't you dare accuse us of stealing. We're your parents. We sacrificed everything to raise you, to give you opportunities we never had. This house, this life, it's all for you and your future." My future? I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen, my student loan balance, accumulated over 4 years of believing I had no other options. "This is my future, Dad. $50,000 in debt that I'll be paying off for the next 20 years. Debt that shouldn't exist." The room fell silent except for my mother's quiet sobs. I looked around the living room, really looked at it for the first time. The new furniture they'd bought, on sale. The 60-inch flat-screen television they'd claimed was a necessary upgrade. The expensive artwork on the walls that my mother said she'd gotten from a friend who was redecorating. All of it paid for with my uncle's money. Money that was meant to give me a head start in life, not fund their home improvements. "I want to see the records," I said quietly. "Bank statements, receipts, everything. I want to know exactly how much was in that account and exactly where every penny went." My father stood up abruptly. "You're not entitled to." "I'm entitled to everything," I cut him off. "That money was legally mine. You were trustees, which means you had a fiduciary duty to use it for my benefit. Instead, you used it for yourselves and lied to me about it for 4 years." My mother looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What are you saying, Maya?" I met her gaze steadily. "I'm saying I'm going to find out exactly what you did with my money. And then I'm going to decide what to do about it." The drive back to my apartment that night was a blur of streetlights and rage. I'd left my parents' house with promises to discuss this calmly when emotions weren't running so high, but there was nothing calm about the fury burning in my chest. They'd stolen my future and packaged it as a life lesson. They'd watched me break myself trying to survive while they enjoyed the benefits of my uncle's generosity. I spent the next 3 days in my studio apartment, surrounded by printouts and legal documents. Mr. Morrison had agreed to meet with me and provide full documentation of the trust fund, including every withdrawal my parents had made as trustees. The paper trail was devastating. $78,000 initial deposit when I turned 18. Additional $5,000 contributions each year for 4 years. Total fund value by my senior year, $98,000. Total remaining balance, $3,247. They'd spent nearly $95,000 of my money over 4 years. The receipts painted a picture of systematic deception. New roof, $18,000. Kitchen renovation, $22,000. My mother's SUV, $28,000. Living room furniture, $8,000. The list went on, each purchase a betrayal wrapped in middle-class respectability. But it was the smaller withdrawals that hurt the most. $200 here, $500 there. Money for dinners out while I was eating cereal for the third meal in a row. Money for my mother's spa days while I was walking to work in shoes with holes in the soles. Money for my father's golf equipment while I was picking up extra shifts just to make rent. Mr. Morrison reviewed everything with the cold professionalism of someone who'd seen family betrayal before. You have grounds for a lawsuit, he said simply. Misappropriation of trust funds is a serious matter. Depending on the jurisdiction, it could be considered a felony. A felony. My parents could face criminal charges for what they'd done. There's something else, Mr. Morrison continued, sliding another document across his desk. Your uncle updated his will shortly before he passed away. He left the bulk of his estate to you directly, with no trustees involved. The house, his investment portfolio, everything. It's worth approximately $2.3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $2.3 million. My uncle had left me everything, probably suspecting that my parents hadn't been truthful about the trust fund. He also left a final letter for you, Mr. Morrison said gently. He asked me to give it to you only if it became clear that the trust fund had been misused. The letter was shorter than the first one, but every word felt like it was written in fire. Maya. If James is giving you this letter, it means my worst fears about your parents were justified. I suspected they weren't being honest about the trust fund, but I hoped I was wrong. I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You deserved better from the people who were supposed to protect you. The inheritance I'm leaving you is yours without any strings attached. Use it to build the life you've always deserved. Don't let anyone convince you to forgive what can't be forgiven. Trust, once broken, must be earned back through actions, not words. Make them face the consequences of their choices. Sebastian. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my purse. Outside Mr. Morrison's office, the world looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. I wasn't the broke college graduate struggling to make rent anymore. I was a woman with resources, with options, with power. And I was going to use every bit of it. My parents called me 6 times that evening. I didn't answer. They texted, asking when we could sit down and work this out as a family. I deleted the messages without responding. They even drove to my apartment building and buzzed my intercom, but I pretended not to be home. I needed time to think, to plan, to decide exactly how I wanted to handle this. Because Uncle Sebastian was right, this wasn't something that could be forgiven with words and tears. This required consequences. The first step was simple. I hired a forensic accountant to go through every transaction my parents had made using the trust fund money. I wanted documentation of every lie, every betrayal, every moment they chose their comfort over my education. The second step was harder. I called my cousin Derek, my father's nephew, who worked as a paralegal in the district attorney's office. Derek had always been the family gossip, the one who knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing it. If I was going to destroy my parents' reputation, Derek would be the perfect vector. Maya. Derek's voice was warm and familiar. I heard about your graduation. Congratulations. Your parents must be so proud. Actually, that's what I'm calling about, I said, my voice carefully neutral. I've discovered some information about my parents that I think you should know about. Information that might interest your colleagues at the DA's office. The silence that followed was pregnant with curiosity. Derek loved nothing more than family drama, and I was about to give him the story of a lifetime. What kind of information? He asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The kind that involves felony theft and breach of fiduciary duty, I said simply. Are you free for coffee tomorrow? I have some documents you might find interesting. Derek agreed immediately, his excitement barely contained. By tomorrow afternoon, everyone in the DA's office would know that Victor and Carmen Reeves had stolen nearly $100,000 from their own daughter's education fund. By the end of the week, it would be the talk of the entire courthouse. But that was just the beginning. The coffee shop where I met Derek was crowded with the usual mix of students and office workers, but I'd chosen a corner table where we could speak privately. Derek arrived precisely on time, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Okay, Maya, you've got my attention," he said, settling into his chair with a large latte. "What's this about your parents?" I slid the folder across the table without ceremony. "Everything you need to know is in there. Bank records, trust documents, receipts for personal purchases made with funds that were legally designated for my education." Derek opened the folder and began reading, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to anger as he processed the information. He was a good man, Derek, despite his love of gossip. He'd always been protective of me, and I could see the fury building in his eyes as he understood the scope of my parents' betrayal. "Jesus Christ, Maya," he whispered, looking up from the documents. "They spent almost everything. While you were working yourself to death just to stay in school." I nodded, my throat tight. "I want to know what my options are, Derek. Not just legally, but practically. What happens if I decide to press charges?" Derek was quiet for a long moment, still flipping through the papers. "With documentation like this? The DA would definitely prosecute. Theft of this magnitude, especially from a trust fund, it's serious business. We're talking potential felony charges, restitution orders, maybe even jail time depending on their criminal history. And if I decide not to press charges? Then nothing happens to them legally," Derek said, his voice hard. "They get away with it. They keep the house they renovated with your money, the car they bought with your money, all of it." I leaned back in my chair, considering. "There's something else you should know. My great-uncle Sebastian left me his entire estate when he died. The house, investments, everything. It's worth over $2 million. Derek's eyes widened. "Holy shit, Maya. You're rich." "I'm rich," I confirmed. "Which means I have options my parents never thought I'd have." We talked for another hour, Derek explaining the legal process, the timeline for prosecution, the likelihood of conviction. By the time we parted ways, I had a clear picture of what lay ahead if I chose to pursue criminal charges. But I also had another plan forming, something more creative than simply letting the justice system handle things. That evening, I made a list of everyone my parents cared about. Their neighbors, their co-workers, their church friends, the members of my mother's book club and my father's golf buddies. All the people whose opinions mattered to them, whose respect they'd built their social lives around. Then I started making phone calls. "Hi, Mrs. Patterson. This is Maya Reeves, Victor and Carmen's daughter. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to let you know about something that's been weighing on my heart." The conversations were similar each time. I presented the facts simply, without editorial comment, letting the evidence speak for itself. I wasn't vindictive or emotional. I was just a concerned daughter sharing information about a difficult family situation. Mrs. Patterson, their next-door neighbor for 15 years, was shocked. "But Maya, they always talked about how proud they were of your work ethic, how you were putting yourself through school." I was putting myself through school, I confirmed. Even though there was money set aside specifically for my education that they chose to use for other purposes. Mr. Hendricks from my father's golf group was more direct. "Are you sure about this, honey? That's a serious accusation to make about your own parents." "I have all the documentation, Mr. Hendricks. Bank records, receipts, the original trust documents. I'm not making accusations, I'm stating facts." By the end of the week, I'd spoken to nearly 30 people in my parents' social circle. I didn't ask anyone to shun them or treat them differently. I simply provided information and let them draw their own conclusions. The results were swift and devastating. My mother called me on Saturday morning, her voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "What have you done, Maya? What did you tell people?" I told them the truth, Mom. The same truth you should have told me 4 years ago. Everyone's looking at us like we're criminals. Mrs. Patterson won't even make eye contact with me. Your father's golf group is treating him like a pariah. The book club canceled our next meeting because they said they needed time to process what I'd done. I felt a stab of satisfaction, sharp and clean. Maybe now you understand how it feels when people you trust betray you. "We're your parents," my mother screamed. "How could you humiliate us like this? How could you destroy our reputation over money?" "Over money?" My voice dropped to a whisper. "Mom, you let me go hungry. You watched me work myself sick. You knew there was money that could have helped me, and you chose to spend it on yourselves instead. This isn't about money, it's about the fact that you cared more about granite countertops than your daughter's well-being." The line went quiet except for my mother's ragged breathing. When she spoke again, her voice was small and broken. "What do you want from us, Maya? What can we do to fix this?" For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy, the ingrained desire to comfort and forgive. But then I remembered Uncle Sebastian's letter, his warning not to let anyone convince me to forgive what couldn't be forgiven. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences," I said simply. "You made choices, and now you're living with the results of those choices." I hung up and turned off my phone. I had work to do. The next phase of my plan required patience, but I had plenty of that. I'd learned patience during 4 years of grinding poverty while my parents lived comfortably on money that should have been mine. I contacted a real estate agent about Uncle Sebastian's house. It was a beautiful property, but I didn't want to live there. Too many memories, too much history. Instead, I wanted to sell it and use the proceeds strategically. "The market for luxury homes is very strong right now," the agent, Mrs. Chen, explained as we walked through the mansion's grand foyer. "A property like this, in this condition, could easily sell for 2.5 to 2.8 million. Perfect. More than enough for what I had in mind." While the house was being prepared for sale, I threw myself into research. I studied my parents' financial situation with the same dedication I'd once applied to my college coursework. Their mortgage information was public record. Their credit history was accessible through various means. Their employment details were easy enough to discover. What I found was illuminating. Despite having access to nearly $100,000 of my money over 4 years, my parents were still financially vulnerable. The house renovations had been expensive, and they'd taken out additional loans to cover costs beyond what they'd stolen from my trust fund. My father's small business was struggling, and my mother's part-time job barely covered their monthly expenses. They were house-rich but cash-poor, with most of their net worth tied up in the property they'd improved using my money. That's when I had my most brilliant idea. The house across the street from my parents went up for sale in early August. It was a lovely colonial, similar to theirs but larger, with a better view and more modern amenities. The asking price was $485,000. I bought it with cash. My parents had no idea, of course. The purchase was made through an LLC I'd established, with all paperwork handled by attorneys. From their perspective, they simply had new neighbors moving in across the street. I spent the next month having the house completely renovated. New hardwood floors, updated kitchen, luxurious bathrooms, a finished basement with a home theater system. Every upgrade was better than what my parents had in their own home. And then I moved in. The moving truck arrived on a Saturday morning in September. I stood in the driveway of my new home, directing the movers and occasionally glancing across the street where I could see my parents peeking through their curtains. My father was the first to venture outside, walking across the street with the awkward stride of someone trying to appear casual while burning with curiosity. Maya? His voice cracked slightly on my name. What are you doing here? I smiled pleasantly, the same smile I'd perfected during 4 years of customer service jobs. Moving in, Dad. I bought the house. Did you know it has twice the square footage of yours? The previous owners really let it go, but the bones were good. I've been renovating for months. His face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning understanding of what this meant. How did you afford? He stopped himself, the answer obvious. Uncle Sebastian left me everything, I said simply. The house, the investments, all of it. Apparently, he suspected that the trust fund wasn't being used appropriately and wanted to make sure I was taken care of. My mother appeared at their front door, still in her robe despite it being nearly noon. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, as if the weight of social ostracism had physically diminished her. Maya, she called across the street, her voice tentative. Can we talk? I considered this for a moment, then nodded. Of course. You're welcome to come over once I'm settled. I'll give you the grand tour. The next few hours were delicious torture. I watched from my new windows as my parents paced their living room, occasionally peering across the street at my house. The movers brought in furniture that was clearly expensive, not ostentatious, but unmistakably high quality. Art for the walls. A baby grand piano for the front room. A luxury car for the driveway that cost more than they made in a year. All of it paid for with the inheritance that Uncle Sebastian had left me because he'd suspected they couldn't be trusted with my future. By evening, my mother couldn't stand it anymore. She knocked on my front door wearing her best dress and a nervous smile. Your new home is beautiful, sweetheart, she said when I let her in. Would you mind showing me around? I was gracious, playing the perfect hostess as I led her through rooms that showcased everything they denied me. The gourmet kitchen where I could cook actual meals instead of surviving on ramen. The library filled with books I could afford to buy instead of borrowing from the library with their broken spines and coffee stains. The home office with a computer that didn't crash every 10 minutes and a desk that wasn't a stack of milk crates. It's lovely, my mother whispered, running her hand along the marble countertop in the kitchen. You've done so well for yourself. Thank you, I said politely. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you have the resources to pursue your goals instead of just surviving day to day. The barb hit home. My mother flinched, her hand dropping from the counter. Maya, about the money, we never meant for things to go so far. We always planned to pay it back. I leaned against the kitchen island, studying her with detached curiosity. When exactly were you planning to pay back $95,000? After you finished spending it on yourselves? We thought we had time, she said desperately. We thought you'd never find out, that Uncle Sebastian would never tell you. We were going to take out loans, refinance the house, something. So your plan was to lie to me indefinitely and hope I never discovered that you'd stolen my future to fund your renovations? My mother started crying then, the same tears that had once moved me to comfort her. But I felt nothing now except a cold satisfaction. We can make it right, she sobbed. We can sell the house, downsize, pay you back every penny. It might take years, but we can do it. I pretended to consider this. And in the meantime? What happens to your credit when you default on your current mortgage to pay me back? What happens when you have to explain to everyone why you're suddenly selling the house you've been bragging about for 4 years? She had no answer for that. Besides, I continued, it's too late for that. I've already filed the police report. Derek helped me understand the process. Apparently, the DA's office takes financial crimes very seriously, especially when they involve vulnerable victims like college students. My mother's face went white. You're pressing charges? Against your own parents? I'm holding you accountable for your crimes, I corrected. There's a difference. She left shortly after that, stumbling across the street to her house that suddenly seemed so much smaller and shabbier in comparison to mine. The criminal case moved forward with inexorable momentum. My parents hired a lawyer they couldn't afford, taking out yet another loan against their house to pay legal fees. The local newspaper picked up the story, local couple charged with stealing daughter's college fund, and suddenly everyone in town knew exactly what Victor and Carmen Reeves had done. My father lost 3 major clients from his consulting business. My mother was asked to step down from her volunteer position at the library. Their church friends stopped calling, stopped including them in social events. The isolation I'd experienced for 4 years became their reality. But I wasn't done yet. The trial was set for the following spring, giving me months to execute the final phase of my plan. I used that time to become visible in all the places my parents had once felt comfortable. I joined the country club where my father had played golf, becoming a popular member thanks to my generous donations to club events. I started attending the same church, where my substantial tithe and volunteer work quickly made me beloved by the congregation. Everywhere my parents went, I was there, living proof of the success they'd tried to steal from me. I didn't gloat or make scenes. I simply existed in their space, a constant reminder of their betrayal and its consequences. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable. My parents pled guilty to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, agreeing to pay full restitution plus damages and accepting 5 years of supervised probation. But the real punishment wasn't legal, it was social. They were pariahs now, the couple who'd stolen from their own daughter. They lost their house to pay the restitution, downsizing to a small apartment across town. My father's business never recovered. My mother took a job at a grocery store, working for minimum wage at the age of 55. I, meanwhile, used my inheritance wisely. I started a scholarship fund for students from low-income families, ensuring that others wouldn't have to choose between education and survival the way I had. I bought a successful small business and grew it into something larger. I invested in real estate, in stocks, in my own future. On the 5th anniversary of that Thanksgiving, when Uncle Sebastian's letter had changed everything, I was featured on the cover of the local business journal as one of the city's most successful young entrepreneurs. The article mentioned my humble beginnings, my struggle through college, and my commitment to helping other students achieve their dreams. My parents probably saw the magazine. I hoped they did. I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd tried to take from me, and exactly what I'd accomplished despite their betrayal. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far. If the price I extracted was too high for the crime they'd committed. But then I remember the nights I went hungry, the jobs that broke my body, the constant exhaustion and fear that defined my college years. I remember the casual way they'd spent my future while lecturing me about the value of hard work. And I remember Uncle Sebastian's final words: "Don't let anyone convince you to forgive what can't be forgiven. Trust, once broken, must be earned back through actions, not words." My parents never tried to earn back my trust. They only tried to minimize the consequences of breaking it. They made their choice when they decided I mattered less than granite countertops and luxury cars. I simply made sure they lived with the results of that choice. Justice isn't always pretty. But sometimes it's necessary. And sometimes, the best revenge is living well while making sure everyone knows exactly why you're living well and they're not. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. 2 years after the trial, I was sitting in my home office reviewing quarterly reports for my business when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. "Is this Maya Reeves?" The voice was elderly, female, and unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Maya." My name is Eleanor Whitman. I was Sebastian's companion for the last 10 years of his life. I nearly dropped the phone. Uncle Sebastian had never mentioned anyone special in his life, had always seemed like the quintessential bachelor living alone in his grand house. I'm sorry, I managed. I didn't know Uncle Sebastian was seeing anyone. Eleanor's laugh was soft and sad. We were very private about our relationship. Sebastian was concerned about how his family might react to him having a romantic partner at his age, especially one who wasn't wealthy like he was. I was just a retired school teacher living on a modest pension. My heart clenched. Even in love, Uncle Sebastian had been protecting someone from my family's potential judgment. Why are you calling me? I asked gently. Because I know what your parents did, dear. Sebastian told me everything, about the trust fund, about his suspicions, about how worried he was for your future. He used to show me your letters, you know. He was so proud of how hard you were working, and so angry that his gift to you was being squandered. I was quiet, processing this revelation that Uncle Sebastian had shared my story with someone who clearly cared about him. There's something else, Eleanor continued. Something Sebastian never told anyone, not even his lawyer. He kept a detailed journal of every conversation he had with your parents about the trust fund. Every lie they told him, every excuse they made when he asked about your progress. He suspected they were stealing from you long before he could prove it. My pulse quickened. Do you still have this journal? I have it right here in front of me. Sebastian made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would make sure it found its way to you. He said it might be important someday. We arranged to meet the following afternoon at a quiet cafe downtown. Eleanor turned out to be exactly what I'd imagined, a small, elegant woman in her 70s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that sparkled with warmth. She carried a leather-bound journal that looked well-worn from frequent use. Sebastian wrote in this every night, she said, sliding it across the table to me. He was meticulous about documentation. It was the businessman in him, I suppose. I opened the journal with trembling hands. The first entry about my family was dated 6 months after I'd started college. Called Victor today to check on Maya's progress. He seemed evasive when I asked about her living situation, claimed she was doing fine, but couldn't provide specifics. When I mentioned increasing the trust fund contributions, he quickly changed the subject. Something doesn't feel right. The entries continued chronologically, painting a picture of growing suspicion and mounting evidence. My uncle had tried multiple times to contact me directly, but my parents had intercepted his calls and letters, claiming I was too busy with studies to chat. Carmen called to thank me for the additional $5,000 deposit, but when I asked her to have Maya call me to discuss her expenses, she said Maya was embarrassed about needing financial help and preferred to handle things through them. This makes no sense. Maya has never been shy about asking questions or expressing gratitude. Drove past the university today and stopped by the coffee shop where Maya works. The manager mentioned she's one of their hardest workers, always picking up extra shifts. If the trust fund is covering her expenses as Victor claims, why is she working so much? Attempted to visit Maya at her dormitory address. The building manager informed me no one by that name lives there. When I called Victor to confirm the address, he claimed she'd moved but couldn't provide the new location immediately. Said he'd have to check with Maya and get back to me. He never did. Page after page documented my parents' deception, their lies growing more elaborate as Uncle Sebastian's suspicions deepened. The final entry was dated just a week before his death. I've instructed James to investigate the trust fund transactions. I can no longer give Victor and Carmen the benefit of the doubt. If they've betrayed Maya's trust and mine, there will be consequences. I'm updating my will tonight to ensure Maya receives everything directly. She deserves so much better than the family that was supposed to protect her. I closed the journal, my hands shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. Not only had my parents stolen my money, they'd isolated me from the one family member who truly cared about my well-being. They denied me years of relationship with Uncle Sebastian, years of knowing that someone was watching out for me. He loved you very much, Eleanor said softly, watching tears stream down my face. He talked about you constantly, worried about you, bragged about your achievements. Finding out what your parents had done, it broke his heart. Why didn't he confront them directly? I asked. Why didn't he just demand access to me? Eleanor sighed. He was afraid of making things worse for you. He thought if he pushed too hard, your parents might cut off contact entirely, and then he'd have no way to help you at all. He was trying to protect you, even while he was investigating. That evening, I sat in my study reading through Uncle Sebastian's journal again, seeing my college years through his eyes. The picture that emerged was of a man desperately trying to help his great-niece while being systematically lied to by the people he trusted to care for me. But it was the final page that hit me hardest. A page I'd initially missed because it was written in different ink, clearly added later. If Maya is reading this, it means my worst fears were realized. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you better. I'm sorry I trusted the wrong people with your future. But I hope the inheritance I'm leaving you will give you the power to set things right. Don't let anyone convince you that family loyalty means accepting betrayal. Make them face the consequences of their choices. You deserve justice, and you deserve so much better than what they gave you. All my love. Uncle Sebastian. P.S. Eleanor has something else for you. I asked her to wait until you were ready. I looked up at Eleanor, who had been sitting quietly while I read. She smiled and reached into her purse, pulling out a small velvet box. Sebastian wanted you to have this, she said, placing it in my hands. It was your great-grandmother's engagement ring. He'd always planned to give it to you when you got married, but after he discovered what your parents had done, he wanted you to have it now. As a reminder that you were loved, truly loved, by someone who wanted nothing but the best for you. Inside the box was the most beautiful ring I'd ever seen, a vintage Art Deco design with a central diamond surrounded by sapphires. It was elegant and timeless, clearly worth a fortune but priceless in terms of sentiment. He also wanted me to tell you, Eleanor continued, that he hoped someday you'd find someone worthy of the love you have to give. Someone who would protect your dreams instead of stealing them. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Derek. I need to amend my victim impact statement, I told him. There's new evidence. The supplemental hearing was scheduled for the following month. My parents had been living quietly since their conviction, trying to rebuild their lives in obscurity. They thought the worst was behind them. They were wrong. Uncle Sebastian's journal was admitted as evidence, documenting years of deliberate deception that went far beyond simple financial theft. The judge was particularly disturbed by the entries showing how my parents had isolated me from Uncle Sebastian, preventing a relationship that could have provided emotional support during my most difficult years. This wasn't just about money, I said during my amended victim impact statement. This was about denying me the love and support of the one family member who truly cared about my well-being. They didn't just steal my financial future, they stole years of relationship with a man who loved me, years I can never get back. The judge was visibly moved as I read excerpts from Uncle Sebastian's journal, his growing concern and helpless frustration evident in every entry. When I finished, he looked at my parents with undisguised disgust. Your crimes were far more extensive than initially understood, he said. You didn't just misappropriate funds, you systematically isolated your daughter from family support and deceived a dying man who was trying to help her. I'm adding an additional year to your probation and increasing the restitution to include punitive damages. But the real punishment wasn't legal. The journal entries, now part of the public record, painted such a damning picture of my parents' calculated deception that even their few remaining sympathizers turned away. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story titled, "The Betrayal Deepens," detailing how my parents had not only stolen money but prevented a loving relationship between Uncle Sebastian and me. My mother tried to call me after the hearing, sobbing apologies and begging for forgiveness. I listened to her voicemail once, then deleted it. Some betrayals are too deep for redemption. 6 months later, I received an invitation that made me smile for the first time in weeks. Eleanor was getting married to Harold, a widower she'd met at her book club. She wanted me to be her maid of honor. Sebastian would have loved this, she told me during our planning lunch. He always worried that I'd be alone after he was gone. Finding love again at my age, it feels like his final gift to me. The wedding was small and elegant, held in Eleanor's garden with just close friends and Harold's family in attendance. As I stood beside her during the ceremony, I thought about Uncle Sebastian and how he'd found love late in life too, even if he'd kept it private. I thought about the journal he'd kept, documenting his growing concern for me, and how even in death he'd continue to protect me by ensuring I had the evidence I needed for justice. After the ceremony, Eleanor pulled me aside. "Sebastian left something else for you," she said, handing me a sealed envelope. "He made me promise to wait until I was sure you'd found your footing, until I was sure you were truly okay." Inside was a letter and a key. "My dearest Maya. If you're reading this, it means Eleanor believes you've healed from the wounds your parents inflicted. I hope that's true. I hope you've learned to trust again, to love again, to believe that you deserve all the good things life has to offer. The key is to a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box 847. Inside, you'll find some family photographs, your great-grandmother's jewelry collection, and the original deed to the family farm where I grew up. It's been sitting empty for years, but the land is beautiful, rolling hills, a creek that runs year-round, old oak trees that have stood for centuries. I always thought it would make a perfect place for someone to build a new life, to raise a family, to create the kind of memories that last for generations. Consider it my final gift to you, not just the land, but the possibility of a future filled with the love and stability you should have had all along. Build something beautiful there, Maya. For yourself, and for the family you choose to surround yourself with. All my love, always. Uncle Sebastian." 2 weeks later, I drove out to see the property. It was exactly as Uncle Sebastian had described, 200 acres of rolling farmland with a creek running through it, framed by mountains in the distance. The old farmhouse was beyond repair, but the bones of it were solid, and I could imagine building something new on the same foundation. Standing there in the afternoon sunlight, I finally understood what Uncle Sebastian had been trying to give me all along. Not just money or property, but possibility. The chance to build a life on my own terms, surrounded by people who chose to love me instead of people who saw me as something to exploit. I pulled out my phone and called the architect I'd been working with on another project. "I have a new job for you," I said, watching the sun set over my land. "I want to build a house. Something beautiful, something permanent. Somewhere I can put down roots and know they'll hold." The house took 18 months to build. During that time, I met Marcus, a civil engineer who was working on the infrastructure for my property. He was kind and funny and treated me like I was worth listening to, a radical concept after years of feeling invisible to the people who should have cared most. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully. I'd learned not to trust easily, but Marcus earned it day by day, choice by choice. When I told him about my family, about the betrayal and the legal battles, he listened without judgment and without trying to minimize my pain. "They didn't deserve you," he said simply. "Their loss." We were married on the property 2 years later, under the same oak trees Uncle Sebastian had played beneath as a child. Eleanor was my matron of honor, Harold walked me down the aisle, and Derek served as master of ceremonies. My chosen family, the people who had supported me through the darkest time of my life. My parents weren't invited. I heard through Derek that they'd seen the wedding announcement in the paper, but they didn't try to contact me. Maybe they finally understood that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Marcus and I honeymooned in Europe, visiting the places Uncle Sebastian had traveled to as a young man. In Paris, we found the hotel where he'd stayed in 1962, and I left a single white rose at the front desk with a note, for Sebastian Moreau, who taught his great-niece that family is about love, not blood. Now, 5 years after that first devastating Thanksgiving, I wake up every morning in the house I built on Uncle Sebastian's land, next to the man who chose to love me exactly as I am. We're expecting our first child, a daughter we've decided to name Sophia Eleanor, after my great-grandmother and the woman who became the grandmother I'd never really had. Sometimes I still dream about my parents, still feel the old anger rise in my chest when I think about what they stole from me. But mostly, I feel grateful. Grateful that Uncle Sebastian saw through their lies. Grateful that he left me the tools to build a better life. Grateful that their betrayal, as devastating as it was, taught me to recognize real love when I found it. The scholarship fund I established has helped over 200 students pay for college without drowning in debt. I get letters from them sometimes, telling me how the financial support allowed them to focus on their studies instead of working multiple jobs. Each letter feels like a small victory over the forces that tried to keep me down. My business continues to grow, and I've used the success to establish a foundation that helps young people who've been financially abused by family members. It's more common than people think: parents who steal their children's savings, relatives who exploit trusts, families who prioritize their own comfort over their children's futures. Last month, I received a letter from a young man whose story was eerily similar to mine. His grandparents had established a trust fund for his education, but his parents had spent it on a luxury vacation and a new car. He'd found my story online and wanted advice on how to proceed. I invited him to the house, served him coffee in the kitchen that Uncle Sebastian's love had built, and helped him understand his options. Not just the legal ones, but the emotional ones too. How to set boundaries. How to demand accountability. How to build a life that isn't defined by other people's failures. The hardest part, I told him, isn't the betrayal itself. It's learning to trust again afterward. But you can do it. You can build something better. He left with Eleanor's phone number. She'd started volunteering with my foundation, helping young people navigate the legal system, and a copy of Uncle Sebastian's final letter to me. Not the original, but a typed version I'd had made for situations like this. Build something beautiful, it ended. For yourself, and for the family you choose to surround yourself with. That's exactly what I've done. What I'm still doing, one choice at a time. My parents live across town now, in a small apartment near the grocery store where my mother still works. I heard through Derek that my father's health isn't good, that the stress of the legal proceedings and social ostracism took a toll on his heart. My mother looks older than her years, worn down by consequences she never thought she'd have to face. Sometimes I wonder if I should reach out, if I should offer some gesture of reconciliation. But then I remember Uncle Sebastian's words about trust that must be earned through actions, not words. My parents have never tried to earn it back. They've never acknowledged the full scope of what they took from me, never attempted to make amends beyond the court-ordered restitution. They made their choice when they decided my future was worth less than their comfort. I've made mine by building a life they can't touch, surrounded by people who value me for exactly who I am. Some stories don't have neat endings, don't wrap up with tearful reconciliations and lessons learned. Some stories are about justice served cold, about consequences that reshape lives, about the choice between enabling bad behavior and holding people accountable for their actions. This is one of those stories. And I'm okay with that. More than okay, I'm proud of it. Because sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to repair relationships that were built on lies in the first place. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to create clear boundaries and stick to them. Sometimes justice looks like a young woman who refuses to let her family's failures define her future. I sleep well at night in the house that love built, on the land that hope gave me, next to the man who chose to see my worth when my own parents couldn't. My daughter kicks against my ribs as I write this, reminding me that the best revenge isn't just living well, it's building something so beautiful and strong that the people who tried to tear you down can never touch it. That's the real victory. Not the money recovered or the legal judgments won, but the life I've created that exists completely independent of their approval or their sabotage. Uncle Sebastian would be proud, I think. I hope he would be proud. And in the end, that's all that matters.